Yep, today we are going to be going through some scene registration techniques. It's quite a vast topic. It's a lot of variables, but I'll give you as much advice as I can. This is me. My name's Daniel Pruitt. I'm a field applications engineer for FARO. I have been for a few years now. My initial background then that got me into this sort of line of work was actually in the military. I became a crime scene investigator and a digital multimedia evidential specialist. And then I was a specialist in virtual crime scene reconstruction. This is how I learned about FARO and then eventually got employed by FARO. However, my time in FARO, I have had the opportunity to branch out into a lot of different expertise, help a lot of different people, and train a lot of different people. So I like to think I'm getting more and more experience with all the different avenues that we have to offer. This is what we're going to be covering today then. We're going to go through what are the different registration options. Again, registration is a very broad subject. There are so many variables, so it's a very difficult thing to cover. There is never a perfect right and wrong answer. I can just give you the best advice I can from my personal experience. But on that, what I do like to use is to bring into a real world example. So I will be bringing in a live project into this meeting, because I think that's a good way of learning. I learn well from it, learning from experience. So bringing in a real world example, then hopefully you can compare that to maybe some of your projects or potentially future projects. I will cover some basics on should you be using targets or not in certain scenarios. I definitely want to be covering error propagation and reports. This is a real big one for me. I think if you can understand your reports well, you can understand your registration and help spot issues. Talk a little bit about project looping, and again, show you my project example. Then as a bonus then at the end, I'm going to do a little bit on fly through videos, see how we're doing with time. But like I said, this is a bit of an add-on, a bit of an extra. If you're only here for the registration, I will let you know when I get to the fly through video. So, if you do want to sign off, I appreciate you giving your time to me today. So, but I only want to really use it for stuff you really want to be here for. If you do want to hang around for fly through videos, brilliant. Then right at the end, then a bit of time for Q&A. So then, registration options. This is, I think, like the earliest stage, I think, where people start to get confused. From my experience, and that's because there are a lot of different things thrown at you, especially when you get to the registration tab, and this is across all software. You're getting asked, do you want to do things automatically, manual, target based, top view, visual, manual, cloud to cloud? There's just so many different it sounds like so many different options, but once you kind of get your head around it, actually there's only real two ways of properly registering scans. That is target and cloud to cloud. If you keep that in mind, things start to get a lot easier. Okay, so you can officially put scans together with target based if you have used targets in your scanning. If not, the only way those scans are actually going to properly register together is using cloud to cloud. Now, how you get to the cloud to cloud stage, that's where all these different methods come in. Okay, so if, say, for example, you're not using targets, normally the go-to method is to use in Scene something called top view and cloud to cloud. What this means is two processes are actually going to run. Firstly, a top view phase. Now I like to look at scans as pieces of a puzzle, and I always teach this as well. If you look at scans as pieces of puzzle, what you're doing in the top view stage then is you are looking down on this puzzle and you are roughly putting them together. That's what the software is doing. It's looking at all these scans and just going to look for a rough alignment between them all. And it's key that it is a rough alignment. It is not a full registration. Now, when things fail, and we all know they do, now and then you have a problem and you end up with auto clusters. It's failed at the top view stage. It hasn't even attempted cloud to cloud, because that's why you're getting a verification pop-up saying, I've got these together, but I haven't managed to get these together. Before we actually go and do a cloud to cloud, I think I need your input. And that's where visual and manual kicks in. So visual registration then, that is all that is you doing the top view stage. The software struggled to do the top view phase for you. So now you're going to have a go. So it's just you roughly alignment. And again, you only have to be rough, okay? You're just trying to get it within, you know, a few meters, if anything. Manual registration is doing the same thing. You are doing a rough alignment. I see people like desperately trying to pick points between two scans to find the perfect 2 points and then, you know, pick a plane. They've got to be perfect. They don't. You're only roughly putting them together. And again, you are doing the top view phase. This is why after you do a visual or a manual registration, you get asked to verify, because you're getting asked to now do a cloud-to-cloud registration, or if you use targets, target registration. So really simplified then, there is only 2 registration formats, target and cloud-to-cloud. You want to be doing one of them at the by the end of what your whole registration format. You really want to be doing one of them. And you should know which one you're going to be doing at the scanning phase, because otherwise you would or wouldn't be putting down targets. Okay, so hopefully that simplifies things a little bit. I understand there is a lot of different formats, a lot of different methods, but most of them are actually just tools to do the rough alignment. Now, again, this is where things differ. If you've already got things roughly aligned, you don't necessarily need to do the top view phase again. So for example, if you've roughly got a project together and you're just trying to improve it, there's no need to keep doing top view cloud to cloud. You can just do cloud to cloud, because the cloud to cloud, the scans are almost going to like pivot on the spot and then look for matching neighboring scans. But again, this is why people often fail in the early stages. I've seen people try and only do cloud to cloud. You can't only do cloud to cloud because your scans aren't roughly aligned. You've got scans pivot on the spot looking for other scans, and they're nowhere near each other. So that's why your registration will fail. So cloud to cloud is like the last thing you do, and it's a thing you can keep repeating to be experimental, keep editing your project structure, and keep improving your results. You don't need to do the whole thing over and over again, otherwise you keep going back to square one. That will become a little bit more apparent in my example I'll show you a bit later. So I refer to targets quite a bit. I will be referring to targets, and I have already. This is what I'm talking about. It's not just one type. There are multiple different types of targets. I'm sure a lot of you are already aware of this sort of stuff. On the left then, we've got the checkerboard, the traditional checkerboard. Really good because you can make your own, you can print them off, and you can use loads of them. The best thing about checkerboards is you can leave them up for a long period of time, especially if you're, say, scanning around a building. One of the biggest a problem I've seen a few times is when people put targets up, they go around a building and then come back on themselves. By the time they come back on themselves, they've moved all their targets and spheres because they're traversing them. So they only have so many. If you do that, your first scan can't register to your last scan, and that's when you start having problems with error propagation, which I will talk about shortly. So I like checkerboards, I like leaving them up. Spheres then, spheres are fantastic because you can view them from any angle. What the software actually does is read that there's a sphere, and it places a point in the dead center of it. So the good thing about the sphere then, it doesn't matter which angle you look at it from, that central point is always the same. So this is really useful, especially for very large open spaces, because your scans often go either side of your sphere. It's just a bit easier to use than, let's say, a checkerboard sometimes. On the right then, that's a marker. This is a little bit more for hand scanning. It's quite small. What's really good about this is you have different unique shapes. They automatically get given a number in the software. But again, this is a little bit more for merging things like focus scans to our new Freestar 2 or something like that. Okay, so why should you be using target base, or why could target base be used? And why isn't cloud to cloud always necessary? So the good thing about target based is it's going to give you a very predictable registration, and it's also very predictable with how good it's going to be and how long it's going to take you, especially registering them together is extremely fast. The reason it's predictable then, because the software isn't even going to look at your clouds with regards to trying to put them together. It is literally picking out 3 or 4 points and matching those points. So you can predict the results you're going to get, and it's quite repeatable. So it's very good for that. Also, some environments will only work when using target-based. I've got a couple of examples where you're going to have to use targets if you're going register your scans together. I'll show you them in just a moment. On a side note though, every environment will work with target-based. It doesn't matter what your environment is, even if you went in for a building where there's lots of different geometry, you could still put targets down if you got the time, because it could give you a backup or a reassurance. You can, if you wish, use targets for every project if you wanted to. I'm not saying that's 100% what you should do, because I do really love cloud to cloud, especially for going in and out of buildings. Target-based can also give you a certain level of accuracy as well. Particularly if there's a lot of moving parts in your scene, it's a little bit easier to read your accuracy and understand your accuracy with target-based. Also, especially when we start looking at things like control points and using survey control, targets are going to be the way forward. So a little bit more on targets then. Target-based can be used to help control your error propagation. I'm going to explain exactly what error propagation is in just a moment, but target-based is definitely a way of helping solve that. And also, it can be used to georeference your entire project. So again, if you've got if you're a practice surveyor, or if you've got access to one, you can use the targets, register them to survey controlled points to not only help control your error propagation, but actually reference your model to the grid. Okay, so here's an example of maybe where you might need, well, where you would need some targets. Things like repeating geometry. This tunnel, for example, the geometry is identical all the way down. You could place a scan anywhere down that tunnel, but the software isn't going to know where along that tunnel that scan could be. There's just no way of knowing, because it's identical all the way down. I see this in things like stairwells as well sometimes, corridors with repeating geometries. Like, for example, if you had a really long hotel corridor and the door is always in the same place with the same spacing. I've seen it in a barrack block, where someone scanned all the way down this long corridor. Because the geometry is identical, with every door is identical, the software's assumed that it's just one door and there's one light, there's one of everything, and all the scans are sat on the same place or in the same location. So repeating geometry is something you need to keep an eye out for. If you do have repeating geometry, get your targets up. Is another example of repeating geometry and lack of geometry is big open roads. So your crash investigators and things like this, again, should be using targets to help you with this. Because again, it would be so hard to even visually place scans yourself in such an environment. If you have lots of buildings around you, then maybe you'll get away with cloud to cloud. Sometimes you do. However, if you want to be safe, get the sphere set out. One more example then is open fields anywhere, big sandy area, something like that, where there's actually a complete lack of geometry. Your cloud to cloud will really struggle. Maybe possible in some areas if you've got like a good excavation or something going on, but I can guarantee the majority of it won't go together or will struggle. I've certainly seen some investigations out in fields and woods and stuff like that, and you have to have targets and spheres, especially if you want to make your life a lot easier. So I've mentioned error propagation. I'd like to show, try and describe exactly what error propagation is, because this is relevant to cloud to cloud and target based. And if you understand error propagation, it will help you with your project strategy before you even start scanning. I know this is unseen in registration, but you can give yourself every possible advantage by understanding things, beforehand, or having a plan. So on the left then, this is a prime example of error propagation. What you can see is a report here, which I'm sure a lot of people here are familiar with. This is a FARO SCENE report. In case you're not aware of how this report works, then each of these gray squares represents a scan or a cluster. It depends on what level of the report you're looking at. If you're looking on a cluster level or the overall folder, and you're just looking at groups of clusters report, or actually inside a cluster, then you might be looking at the scan report. Either way, each of these gray squares represents a scan or cluster. The green square then represents the registration between those two items. So for example, hopefully you can see my mouse. The first grey square and the second grey square have a green square joining them. And this green square represents the registration between those two scans. This white square below then is telling me that there is no registration or lack of between scan 1 and scan 3. Those two scans are not registered together. So in theory, if I wanted to know the potential, I say potential deviation between scan 1 and scan 3, I would have to add these two deviations together. That's the worst case scenario. So what if you have this happening a lot, like in this case, say I'm scanning down a street and every scan is only connected to its adjacent scan, potentially my error is stacking and getting higher and higher. This is error propagation. So this is what this little graph shows here, that my deviation could be growing and growing and growing. Let's compare that then to an open environment, and you can start to predict what your reports will look like. The more you look at reports and the more you play with them, you can start to almost visualize your scans and how it's going to look. You can start picking rooms out and open spaces. So for example, this is a very large open mechanical space. You can tell because, for example, scan 1 has green going all the way down. That means scan 1 has registration to all of the other scans. Okay. There's the odd point where, say, scan 2 can't see scan 4. They might be either side of, a large machine or something, but the majority can all see each other. What this means then is error propagation cannot be happening. The error cannot be growing throughout this scene. Now, I understand that this, this is a good example, what you want to achieve, but this isn't always possible. If you're scanning around a building or through a building, you can't get results that look like this all the time. There's often methods and things you can do, like much larger scans or scan grouping with targets. I'm not going to go into those today, but the majority of the time you can't achieve this. What we need to aim to do is minimize error propagation. Error propagation is often going to happen no matter what, but you can minimize it, and we minimize it by looping. So here's an example again of a very linear registration. Every scan is only registered to its adjacent scan, or every cluster is only registered to its adjacent cluster. But because scan 1 is registered to scan 12, and I can see that here by this little green registration, okay? So scan 1 is registered to scan 12. That is shown here on my error propagation chart. Scan 1 can only have so much deviation to scan 12. What that means then is my error propagation can only get so high, potentially, until it has to come back down, because I know my first and last scans are registered. What this means, long story short, is you need to aim to loop where possible. Loop through buildings, open up all the doors. If you're going to scan into a building through the front door and you've already gone around the building, make sure you put a scan by the back door as well, because then your internal scans are going to loop with your external scans. If you're using targets, make sure you're always leaving targets down at your start point. So when you loop back round, your first and last scans are actually going to loop together, and you're going to massively minimize error propagation. Again, what I did mention earlier, this can be done with control points. So if I had surveyed control points, say for example, this was a tunnel. If I had control points at the start of the tunnel and at the end of the tunnel, my first and last scans are both registered to the control points. So again, my error propagation can only go out of control so far until it has to come back down. It's all about minimizing that potential. And hopefully this example I'm going to give you, this project example, will show that this in a real life example of how error propagation is causing a problem and how it can be noticed and fixed. So I helped a customer with this particularly large project. There was no targets and no spheres at all. There's no survey control. This is all going together with cloud to cloud. Now the project is a lot bigger than this. However, this is just a small area as an example. Very large building, and you can see we've got this very natural loop I've picked out. I picked this out actually in the project to work on anyway because it was a very good internal strong point. If I can get this loop together and working correctly, then when I start bolting on loft spaces or external rooms out to the side, you know, that error propagation's kind of already been closed off, and it's not affecting anywhere else. It's just an additional room, you know, it can't be growing too wildly out of control. So for me, the key was to find this loop, get it working, make it nice and strong, and then start attaching additional things to it. However, not all is as it seems. This is the initial result. And now I'm guilty of this as much as everybody, but when you see this correspondence view, it looks as you expect. I looked at this and went, yeah, this looks great. And you know, a lot of the time, I know people will just go, yep, finalize this one. I'm happy with that registration. However, if we look at the report, things get you know, a little bit more questionable on the initial results. So this is the initial report. Now, what I'm going to actually do is open this up in Scene quick so I can show you it properly. Just bear with me. Okay, so this is the exact same report in Scene. Now, is at this phase, then I noticed there was a problem. Now, this doesn't look as smooth as, you know, the error propagation charts I was just showing you. The reason is because these clusters are named and they're in alphabetical order. If you was to name them in alphabetical order, it would be a little bit more easy to read. I'm not saying you should name all your clusters in alphabetical order going around in a loop, but if you want help looking at your report, it's something you could consider. But then again, with practice, you kind of just glance at these reports and see the problems anyway. So it's at this stage I noticed that actually there's 2 of these clusters don't have enough connections. So each of these clusters should have 2 registrations. Again, if I just show you again here quick, there's 6 clusters. Every cluster should have 2 connecting clusters because it's going around in a loop. So say, for example, this cluster here, if you hover over it, it tells you the name. And this one here shows me that I have registration to this cluster and to this cluster. Now, this cluster up here, the top one, has only got 1 registration. And this cluster right here has only got 1 registration. So why does 2 of my clusters only have 1 registration? So if you pick these 2 clusters out, it's this cluster here, this brown one, and this pink one. These 2 clusters only have 1 connection. That means they are not connected here. There is a break in my registration, in my overall project. The rest of it's working fine, but there's a break here. You can also see this in a much easier way if you scroll down. And you can see right here, you've got connections, and it will tell you which cluster is connected to which cluster, okay? So keep an eye out for this. Again, with practice and when you're building your projects, you can start to predict what your registration results will be. And when you start putting all these clusters together, you can start to predict which clusters are going to be connected with which clusters. So it's now, and in this report phase, you need to confirm that your predictions are going the way you think. You should know which clusters are going to be connected to which clusters, or which ones, you know, a key joining cluster, and should have all these other ones attached to it. If it's meant to be that, check. Come into here and actually have a good look, because I've been guilty of this in the past as well. When you see this correspondence view and then you look at this maximum error, you go, this looks good to me, finalize, and that is it. You don't go any further. Now the problem here is Scene or any software can only give you a deviation for 2 things that it knows are meant to be connected. If it doesn't know that these 2 clusters are even meant to be connected, how can it give you a deviation between them? Or why would it give you a deviation between them? So you need to make sure you have the connections you want before even glancing at these numbers, really. you know, what's the point of having a good maximum error if, you know, half the project isn't even registered together? And this is where it can be a little bit misleading. For me personally, I would rather see higher errors here, but more registration values. Because then at least I know what my error propagation is building up to, and I can see that error. Whereas most of the time you can't see your error because of the error propagation and it just building. If you have more registrations and more connections, you are likely going to have a higher deviation result, a higher maximum error or higher mean point error. And even your minimum overlap will go down. Let's say scan 1 could see scan 8. You might only have a tiny overlap, but it doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Just having that connection there is still good. So try not to get too caught up on these numbers a lot of the time. So back to my project then. We've located the problem now. We used the report and I've found that there's a break. When you look at it a lot closer, and there's no way you'd see this in the correspondence view initially because it's a very big project. And when you look in, this is a very small area. But when you actually look at the problem, there is quite a vast gap between these two clusters. You know, it's almost a meter, including the both horizontal and vertical deviations. This is dangerous, not just because this is out here, but if this is only a small part of the project, I'm expecting to attach more and more and more, then that deviation is going to grow more and more as the project builds and gets larger. That tiny little break is only going to cause bigger and bigger problems. And this is where all of a sudden you don't have, you know, windows lining up to external and stuff like that. And I've seen this on small projects too. I've seen this same problem and the same fix I did for them with, you know, just like a 2-bed house, a detached house. So this isn't just for very large scaled issues. So I found my error. Now I need to come up with a plan of fixing things. So how do I fix things? For me, most of the time fixing things is being able to manipulate the project structure. If I can break down the clusters or reorganize the clusters, I can usually fix things. So that's usually my go-to method. Again, if you look at this like it's a puzzle, what I've essentially got is 6 very large pieces of a puzzle. Now, when you consider error propagation could be existing within each cluster, what happens is when a cluster is finished, those scans are locked in place in that cluster, and that cluster becomes one big piece of the puzzle. So if I had error propagation in all of my clusters, then what I might have here is 6 clusters that are just all slightly the wrong shape. Now, if they are all slightly the wrong shape, what that means is they can't all physically connect. Like a puzzle, if one piece is the wrong shape, if I join it down here on the bottom left, it's going to break somewhere else. It will have to pop out of place because the pieces are fixed in shape. So what I did to fix this example, and what I do on a much smaller example, is sometimes break down the clusters. Sometimes I completely just make all the scans loose. Now, going back to the registration at the beginning and the different types of registration, all of my pieces are in place already. They are all roughly aligned. The top view is done, whether it's visually, manually, or the automatic top view. So if I do start reorganizing this by making them into smaller clusters, which is what I'm going to do, just to give them that bit of wiggle room, if I start reorganizing this, and when the registration will break, however, I don't need to fully re-register everything because everything's already in place and or everything's already roughly aligned. Just because you change a project's format, like the clustering and moving scans about, it doesn't mean that it's physically moving the scan in its 3D space. The scan is still sat there, situated adjacent to the scans it was. So all you have to do is do cloud to cloud. This is where you can be experimental because cloud to cloud doesn't actually take that long most of the time, depending on the size of the project. It's far easier to be experimental with cloud to cloud than if you keep pressing top view cloud to cloud, you're starting from the beginning every time. So this is my format. I'm going to break everything down into smaller chunks. If I break everything down and re-register everything, make sure I have good registrations on each individual cluster, there's a lot more freedom for slight movement. If there's a lot more freedom for slight movement, then I should be able to close that loop. And when that loop's closed, again, I will have error propagation between my clusters. However, it can only go so high and have to come back down. The key is to get that loop closed. This is what I went for. I broke it down into multiple clusters, quite a few more. There's some really neat segregation parts in a lot of these clusters, especially these long ones. Broke it all down. And then that gave it just that bit of wiggle room, as I mentioned. This is the result. Again, my errors haven't changed too much. They're actually very, very similar. My mean point errors come down a little bit, probably because there's more registrations. And my overlap's very similar. So again, there's not a lot of difference in the numbers. So at first glance, this doesn't look actually any different. But in fact, all of my clusters now have 2 registration points. So it means my loop is closed. Now, just for presentation purposes, what I then done was I renamed all these clusters. Because if I rename them all, it will then change the order of them. This is the exact same report. The percentage error, max error, mean error, all identical. This is the exact same report, except I've just numbered it. So numbered the clusters so you can read it easier. And as you can see, we've got that result that I was looking for. And that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation, that looping result. So although I have a linear registration, my first cluster is registered to my final cluster. So now my error propagation is under control and it's not breaking out, and I don't have that big meter gap anymore. This is the previous break and how it looks now. So you can see that that previous break is no longer there. It's registered nice and tight. So again, it's a matter of locating the problem or even realizing you have a problem in the first place. A lot of the time, the only way to find it is understanding your reports and diving into your reports quite carefully, because that number isn't going to be enough to help you find it. You do need to look at your connections and your predicted connections. So I did a little bit of fine tuning. I don't know if you noticed, but I actually have a little orange square here. I don't know why, but it was bothering me. I wanted to fine tune it just that little bit. So I'll show you how I fine tuned this. Now I did re-register all of the sub-clusters with cloud to cloud, experimenting with the sub-sampling to get the best result possible for each individual cluster. However, there is one cluster that was causing me a above 9 mil error, and it was this one up here. Okay, this orange one. So after a little bit of investigating, then I looked into the cluster, and there was one scan in particular that was giving me a bit of a bad result within the cluster itself. Now, I could have just removed that scan and then re-registered that cluster, re-registered the whole thing. That would have probably solved the problem. However, I liked the data that was in that scan, and it was kind of part of that, quite an essential part of that that room. It really filled the gaps. So what I did then, a bit of a, I don't know, maybe an unusual method. I made 2 subclusters for this for this cluster. One of the clusters within it had my key scans for my overall loop. So it had my threshold scans, both here and here, and it had 1 or 2 scans that run down the bottom of the room. My other cluster contained the error and all of the other information that was in that room. What this meant then, by separating the 2 clusters, I have one cluster without any error in it, or without the larger error in it. What that's allowed me to do then is negate that error from being part of my overall loop. I hope that makes sense. It's a little bit of a weird one to describe. I'll just draw it out for you real quick. So there's 2 clusters now within this cluster that go like this. One of them is this lower half, and it's all good. It's got minimal error, and it's got the key scans in. The other half has a bad scan here. Now that error still exists. So if I was to, you know, attach another room up here, it's going to have a knock-on effect. But the key thing for me is I didn't want this error being part of the overall loop. So that's what I've done. I've just separated it into 2 subclusters, re-registered it, and then registered the overall thing again. Let me just minimize this. And then this is the result. So I've just brought it down a little bit. I've got a couple of extra mil reduced, and now it's all green because it's under my thresholds, my desired thresholds that I've got set up in Scene. It really wasn't necessary. It was, like I said, just a little bit of fine tuning. I just wanted to make it a little bit better for that area, and stop that deviation having a knock-on effect on the rest of my loop. Okay, that's actually me done for registration. So again, I will answer your questions as much as I can at the end. However, as a little bit of a bonus, I want to do some video fly-through. If you're not here for video fly-throughs, obviously feel free to log out at any point, but thank you for your time. This is recorded if you do want to come back and have a little look at it anyway. However, this won't take too long. So I got asked to show some people a few tips on video fly-throughs, and I'll give like a little live demo. And I've got a few of my key tips here, because these are mostly tips that I often see maybe people are doing wrong, or I spot it you know, in people's videos on the internet and things like that. Okay, firstly I'll show you, I'm sure most people know roughly how to do video fly-throughs here, but I'm just going to boot up my version of Scene, and I'll open up a suitable project. So I've just got a very random just project. It's just a couple of scans inside a like a practice building on here. What we'll do is just remove any existing viewpoints. So in case you don't know already, video fly-throughs are done using viewpoints in Scene. It's a very easy method. And to be honest, I really like it. So even when I end up going into other software, I do often tend to come back to Scene to do my video fly-throughs, just because I'm used to it. Like I said, I've had some practice with it. So what we're going to do to create a video fly-through is use this function up here called viewpoints. If you press the drop down, we have create viewpoint. When you create it, it will make an automatic name called perspective camera. Press OK, and it will populate your structure tree over on the left. Now these viewpoints are handy anyway, because you could go anywhere, get lost, like in your world, not know where you are. If you right click your viewpoint and press locate, it will take you to where you set that viewpoint. And that's down to everything. It doesn't matter if you change perspective or, you know, like the, between orthographic or perspective mode, or you change your field of view, it will reset everything and bring it back to how you was at that viewpoint. So what we're going to do is we're going to use these viewpoints as keyframes. Keyframing animation is keyframing is a term that's used in animation a lot. I'm sure you've already seen it in video editing software or other animation software, 3D modeling software. Keyframing is used a lot. What keyframing means then is there are essential frames to your animation path. This comes from basic drawing animation. So traditionally then with drawing animation, they used to do it like we did at school when you had a flip book, a note, you know, a big pad and a pen, and you used to do your little stick man animation, and as you go, you keep drawing the next one and the next one and the next one. By the time you get to the end, your little man has completely changed size, you know, and your animation completely warps out of control and it looks really strange. This was a noticeable problem, and animating got reinvented to keyframing. What this means is you draw the first frame of an event and then the last frame of an event, and then you fill in the gaps. That way you can compare your first frame and last frame, make sure they're really good, and then fill in the gaps. They do that in animation now. They have keyframe artists, the best artists. They will do the keyframes and then get another junior artist to just fill in all the gaps. We're doing the exact same thing. And if you keep that concept in your mind, it will make things easier. So for example, if I make one keyframe here, which I've done, and then make another keyframe here, create a viewpoint. When I create a camera path, what will happen is the software will fill in the gaps between here and here, the easiest possible route. Now there are a few little things you can do to adjust that route. However, that's the concept. Now, just quick on keyframing then, you need to bear it in mind, because if you are, say, doing a fly through a building, like say if I wanted to make my camera path go through this building and turn left, you have to be aware that the software is going to make the easiest possible route between two keyframes. So for example, if I have one keyframe and my camera is looking that way, looking north, then I have another keyframe looking here. What the software is going to do is take these two keyframes and fill the gaps, the best possible, easiest route, the shortest route. What that means is the center point here, if I was to fill in this keyframe like the computer is going to do, would look like this. I hope that makes sense. Well, that means it's going to start to turn right now. And what you end up doing is drifting around corners. And I see this a lot in people's videos, this drift. So with that concept of keyframing then, what you really need to do is add another keyframe here, looking this way. So now the software will fill the gaps from A to B and then B to C. So it will turn between B and C. That's keyframing, and that's how it's working, okay? Right, my first point then, now we're creating some keyframes. I've made two, one, then two. I'm gonna make a nice little pan around of this building. So I'll make another keyframe here. One of my top points is know your zoom, okay? If you go to the settings in scene and go to views, we have this, it's quite new actually, use positional zoom instead of optical zoom. Traditionally, it was always set to optical zoom. And this is where you'll see this mistake a lot, and I'm sure a lot of people have done it in the past. I used to do it by accident as well, because this never used to be an option. What this means is when you use the mouse wheel, it won't do a positional zoom. It will instead do an optical zoom. Let me show you what that means. So let's say, for example, I'm stood over this bathroom right now. With optical zoom enabled then, if I use the mouse wheel to try and zoom in, what's happening is I'm not actually moving off the spot. I'm actually still situated above the bathroom. If you pan down, I'm still there. I have not moved anywhere. All what's actually happening is I'm stretching the screen, okay? I'm changing the field of view almost. And as you go in and out, things get a bit distorted. If I go try and zoom out, then it gets really distorted. Again, I'm still situated above the bathroom. Now, if I create a viewpoint like this, and then move around and try and zoom in on something, create another viewpoint, that optical zoom is saved in the viewpoint. So what you tend to find is people with video fly-throughs where their optical zoom keeps changing, and it's really disorientating. It makes your stomach kind of turn a little bit. It feels quite uncomfortable, that changing in motion. So when I say know your zoom, if you do use optical zoom, I imagine you know how to zoom in and out with a mouse instead, using both mouse buttons. If not, and you want to use the mouse wheel, make sure you're on positional zoom. That way, actually using the mouse wheel will change the position of the camera. So that's one of my favorites, because I do often see perspective changing throughout people's videos. Okay, I'll just put one more viewpoint down real quick then. And actually, no, I'll do one more so we've got a complete pan around. I've got 4 cameras now, four viewpoints, 4 keyframes. At the moment, they are viewpoints, but they're going to act as keyframes. If you locate them, you can get a rough idea of what this is going to look like. Next thing to do then is go to our apps at the top. So if you haven't already, you can install video for free. If you need help finding this, you can just go to the apps over on the left, and you can browse apps online and you'll be able to find the video application there. Now you may have Video Pro. They are pretty much identical, except Video Pro will remove that scene watermarking for you. But not only that, you can add your own watermarks as well. If you do want to create your own videos and you want to, or, for no one else to steal your video, you can put your own watermark on top of it. It doesn't really matter which one I open, so run the same. But if I just open one of these, what I need to do is create a new camera path. And this is the point then I can add my different viewpoints I've created as keyframes. And you can mix and match here. You might have lots of different viewpoints for other reasons. Pick out the ones you want and add them. This is the earliest phase as well, where you can preview your path. So it will change a little bit, okay? Because the software is going to do more of a smoothing between your paths than it is just, diving between one camera than the other. Now there's 2 buttons down here, which I'd like you to highlight you to. One of them, this top one, is a little wiggly line. I know it's probably hard for you to see on your end, but it's a little wiggly line that has 5 dots situated on it. What this means is you will tell the software that it must go through your camera viewpoints. Absolutely spot on. It will 100% at one point be directly on your camera viewpoint. The bottom one then says you don't have to go right on top of my viewpoints, just make the smoothest path possible. Okay, 2 different options do 2 very different things. Now, I'm just going to close this. Let me demonstrate roughly what they're both for then. Again, I'll do my little example. Let's say I want to do a fly through in here. And I do 3 camera viewpoints. If I use that top option that says you must go through my viewpoints, the software will make the smoothest possible version it can, where it has to go through your viewpoints directly. So it will do this. If you use the bottom option, the software will make a nice smooth curve between them, not necessarily going right through them, depending on where your other viewpoints are. So I do something more like this. You start to see people cutting through doorways, cutting corners, and it can be a little bit disorientating. It can really throw you off when you start flying through walls unintentionally. This is why it's doing it. It's literally one button, okay? So you need to make sure you're selecting the right one. Where the other one's useful then is, where the other one's useful is actually in the scenario I'm using here. So I'm doing a nice big pan around. All I've done is created 4 viewpoints. So let's say I'll just draw them on here. 1, 2, 3, and 4. If I was to select the viewpoint that goes directly through my camera paths, what I'll end up with is quite a square sort of camera path. It goes through my viewpoints, but it's not very smooth, and you'll feel the corners as you get to them, okay? And so on. If you pick the one that's the smoothest option, it doesn't have to directly go through your camera paths. That's when you'll get this nice round, even with just 4 points, you'll get this nice round version, okay? Just bear in mind, though, that if you are using this function and using this option, your camera path is going to come inwards. So maybe just step out slightly with your viewpoints, help keep everything in frame. Let me just remove all this. So for this option then, I'm going around. Let's say I create a new camera path. I add them all. I want the nice smooth option, so I'm going to use the one at the bottom, the one that dodges the camera part, the viewpoints, that gives me the smoothest camera path. I'm also going to tell it to loop. If I tell it to loop, the starting frame will be the same as the ending frame, and I can just leave my video running and running and running forever. So I'm going to press loop path, press next, ask you to save your camera path, and then you get your exporting window. Here you can change your name, adjust your resolution. I don't tend to go lower than 1080. And your frame rate, how many frames a second? I wouldn't go below 30, to be honest. I do tend to run it on 60, so my video can look as smooth as possible. Here then, the duration is your easiest method for adjusting your speed of your video. If you make your overall video a lower speed, a lower timing, the speed's going to be a lot quicker because it has to go zip around it all, okay? And it's that easy, and you press render. You can preview it, sorry, when you're on the when you're on the exporting screen, you can preview it and you can check the speed. If you're not happy with the speed, make it faster or slower as needed. With all this then, I would recommend keeping your videos as simple as possible. If you want to go around the building and go through it, do 2 separate videos, because the speed is going to be determined by like an average of all your points and their distance. And not only that, you want 2 different styles of camera path going around and going in the building. Otherwise, you're going to have either a squared path going around it, or you're going to be cutting corners and cutting doorways as you go through it. Just do multiple videos, and I use video editing software then just to transition them together and make nice simple fades. So keep it simple, 100%. Don't try and do too much of your video, otherwise things will get too complicated and start to look a bit messy, in my opinion. It's a very, very simple video of a high resolution. I don't try and do too much of it, just a nice, slow moving, smooth camera, just so you can see the detail. I want to give people time to actually visualize the detail. I run it on 60 frames a second, so again, it moves nice and smooth. Another sneaky trick I use then is to render the same video twice. If I render the same exact video twice, but with a change made to the point cloud, i.e. adding a clipping box, I can just layer the 2 videos on top of each other and then add a transition. So in this example then, I add a transition between the 2 video paths, which are identical. So it's seamless. Everything's identical except that clipping box being added. And I use this on buildings a lot as well. So you could be doing a nice fly around a building. During that fly around, you have the clipping box add in, and then the roof fades away or the correct wall fades away. It's so easily done. All you do is render the same video twice, one with the clipping box, one without. Transition the 2 together in editing software. It's dead easy, and you get these really nice simple fades. Again, I keep this really nice and simple and smooth. This is just a constant looping video. And there's my tips. Understand your zoom, pick your choice in camera path, but because you're picking a choice in camera path, make sure you keep it simple, and then do all the creative stuff in the editing software. Just fade multiple videos together. I promise your video will look a lot nicer and smoother. And that is all for me. I will have a little look in the Q&A quick whilst you've got time. But like I said, we have got a lot of people in here today. I'll go through what I can. However, if there's any leftover questions, I'll simply put them into like a PDF document or something like that, and we'll email that out. How to avoid scans pivoting a lot around X and Y axes, as I assume scanner leveling would be correct, and it should pivot around Z axis. In the end, I can be certain that the scans are at level. So it does depend on what scanner you're using. Hopefully you're using a focus, and you'll have a dual axis compensator in there. The dual axis compensator does a really good job of leveling things out, and you want to make sure inclinometer is set to on when you're doing your processing, your registration. And the same with the compass as well. It does really help with putting things together, having the compass on. But this should all be automatic. I have seen problems in the past with people, the odd scan pivoting off at a really strange angle. It's due to a registration or due to people putting down points and planes and the software trying to figure things out. Make sure you keep saving, and if you do all of a sudden have a scan suddenly like turn on its side for some reason, it's something that's gone wrong in the registration phase. Best thing you can do is come back rather than try and recorrect it. I mean, you can level it out easy enough, but I would just revert and see where I've gone wrong in my registration. Would it be feasible to register with cloud to cloud and then after that register target survey points? 100% yes. So there's two different things you could do. You could have, say, two ends of a tunnel. You could register them to survey control points first. So they are being used to eliminate error propagation, and then cloud to cloud, the whole set of scans between. Or you could register an entire project cloud to cloud and then just add them to grid using the survey coordinate points. So then use the targets within them, and the whole thing will move together to register to the control points. Just because you're using cloud to cloud, it definitely doesn't mean you shouldn't, be using control points. They are still very much apparent. I hope that answers your question. Okay. How do you say anti-correspondence and when? So this is kind of a whole other thing. It's going to be going into the old other interface. I'll have to put that into an email for you. Unfortunately, it's kind of a bit of a long one. And there's only really just coming back as well. We're bringing it into the new interface. When should clusters be locked? A cluster will automatically be locked when it's been registered. So as soon as a cluster is completed, it will go green. It's automatically locked. I would keep it. The only time you want to unlock it really is if you need to adjust it and edit it. Just because you're locking a cluster, it doesn't mean it's locked in its 3D space. It means the actual the scans within it is locked, like the scan manager. Thank you. Is it possible to get the recorded video? Yes, 100%. You should be getting a email after all of this. Hopefully I can go through some more of the questions, and yeah, you can have this recording. It will be available to you. So I'm kind of seeing more and more, and it's ticking up now, so I'm probably going to be missing questions. I'm sorry. Have I heard of somebody? No, sorry. No problem at all. Thank you for the thank yous. Since in 2021, right click on options of viewpoints and modify the viewpoint. Okay, sounds good. Yeah, that's a nice idea. I tend to create new viewpoints when I'm not happy with one, so yeah, I'll have to have an experiment with that. Thank you. Okay, what I'll be doing then, I will be ending the recording here. Like I said, there's a lot of questions. We've got a lot of people in here. What I will try and do is answer as many as I can, and we will put that into the email for everybody with the recording. Okay, so we will be ending this here. Thank you all so much for taking the time to view the webinar at your busy schedule.